Hi, my name is Sampath, and I'm at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. I've been on the faculty here for 10 years, and I'm the Associate Professor of the Philosophy of Justice, Rights, and Social Change. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome this year's Gitler Prize winner, Professor Carol Anderson, the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. Thank you, Professor Anderson, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think you beat the winner, so that's a good thing to be here, even though we're waiting today. So we have a number of important issues to engage with Professor Anderson today. We're going to take you through her 5 major works, and we're going to start at the beginning, which takes us back to 2003. And I have 2 questions that I want to couple together for your first 2 works. Eyes Off the Prize, the United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights, 1945 to 1955. And Bourgeois Radicals, the NAACP and the Struggle for Colonial Liberation, 1941 to 1960. So my question, Professor Anderson, is if you can take us back to that time and thinking about the contemporaneity of the birth of the NAACP and then the United Nations, the focus on human rights in that period, in the age of Jim Crow. How does that context help us understand the slow progression in which the human rights agenda gets narrowed into a civil rights platform that emerges really in the 60s? And what does that say about today? Because some of us feel that the Black Lives Matter movement, the social movement, is a human rights platform at its core and its essence.
At its core.
When others may want to view the more narrow view of how we continue to fight for our civil rights. So how do we connect the past and the present in your first works?
Thank you so much for that question, Raj. Thank you. Eyes Off the Prize. Let me give you a sense of where it even emerged. It emerged from my question about how my neighborhood became the hood. Because growing up, I saw lots of hard-working folks, God-fearing folk. You'd walk into their house and on their mantelpiece they would have the Trinity, right? JFK, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King, right? Or Jesus, right? They'd have some version of that Trinity on their mantelpiece. And so these are folks who believed in America, who believed in all of the narratives that we've got. You work hard, you take good care of your kids, you believe in God, you believe in America. And to see those good, honest, hard-working folk, how that neighborhood descended into a place where the news would say, on the Near East Side today. And I thought, how does this happen, particularly when we have this powerful civil rights movement that happened? How does this happen? And as a scholar, you start hunting. You start hunting. And what I found was that in the early 1940s, as the U.S. was beginning to enter the Second World War, there was this discussion within the NAACP and the black community about what this war was for, what this war was really about. It was about taking down white supremacy, Aryan supremacy, and it was about honoring the components of the Atlantic Charter, which dealt with freedom from fear and freedom from want. Those are human rights. And so they then began articulating human rights, because what they said was that what is happening and has happened to the black community is not simply a civil rights violation. It is a human rights violation. Therefore, it's going to take a human rights solution to deal with the human rights violation. And what's the difference between human rights and civil rights? We understand civil rights as being our Bill of Rights, the right not to be illegally searched and seized, the right to free speech, freedom of religion, the right to a speedy and fair trial, the right not to have cruel and unusual punishment. Human rights, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to health care, the right to employment. When you begin to put those together, you begin to see how, when you think about where we are today, when we're dealing with health disparities, when we're dealing with school systems that are abysmal, when we're looking at income disparities, so we don't have equal pay for equal work. When you're looking at all of these components, you know you're looking at a continuing, ongoing human rights crisis. And so the black community and the NAACP began to organize and mobilize during the Second World War to fight for human rights as the standard about what it would take to bring this nation into alliance with what it says it is. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And so I asked myself, because there was also this moment where in 1965, Malcolm X says, how's a black man going to get his civil rights before he gets his human rights? And everybody was like, yeah, man, that's brilliant. Wow. And I looked at that and I said, you know, the NAACP said this over 20-some years ago, before. Why? What is powerful enough to create that level of amnesia in the black community? What is powerful enough so that the black community forgets that it in fact had championed human rights? And that was this deep dive then into the Cold War and anti-communism and McCarthyism, and seeing how human rights, the right to health care, for instance, gets linked up with communism and the Soviet Union. So if you advocate for the right to health care, you must be a communist. And during the second Red Scare, to be labeled a communist or a communist sympathizer was basically to end up on the Attorney General's list, to lose your funding, to lose your status, to lose your ability to function. And so you saw this massive push against the NAACP's advocacy for human rights, where there was this moment after the NAACP had submitted a petition to the UN charging the U.S. with violating African Americans' human rights. It was a beautiful petition, beautifully documented, from the founding of this nation all the way through to 1945. Just really laid it out, what these human rights violations were. And there was this maneuvering on the part of the U.S. to see to it that that petition did not see the light of day. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights. She was also a member of the NAACP's board of directors. And she was like, oh no, oh no. So one of the things she said to Walter White, who was the head of the NAACP, after the petition got just squashed with all kinds of bureaucratic maneuvers and gymnastics in the UN committees, was only a communist-dominated group would put a petition up before the UN like this that the Soviets would use. And Walter White is going, no, you know we're not communist. You know we're not communist. And so when you've got Eleanor Roosevelt, who's on your board of directors, basically saying you are a communist, the NAACP is like, oh, this is some territory where we have to think about how do we protect what we can and use the Bill of Rights to try to advocate and back off of human rights, although we know that human rights is what we need. Yeah.
Very powerful, Professor Anderson. I mean, your work teaches us the history of the resistance that's built into our society to not talk about human rights violations in our own country because we're so busy proclaiming the violations everywhere else. The forerunner of critical race theory, the great Derek Bell, highlighted this issue of how our black soldiers during World War II would fight for democracy and fight against all the evils of Nazism, only to return to the moral shame of a human rights pathology in the heart of our society with segregation. And for that context to then illuminate our present, that today given this hangover of equating anyone who fights for human rights, like the right to economic equality and income redistribution, universal health care, which we have for now, that these are somehow synonymous with communism. So your insight said, well, the outside world, the global context, especially during decolonization, has everything to do with what's happening on the inside in our own society when you see it through the black struggle and the black lens. Which takes me to the work that I think you're the most famous for, because we're still kind of catch up to all the new works, which we'll come back to in a couple of years once we still are trying to process. But what strikes me about White Rage in 2016 is that there's a rare moment when a scholar, first of all, coins a phrase and publishes a work that is contemporaneous with a moment that is cataclysmic in our society, which we all feel, and many of us, not all, but many of us, let's say in the academy, see as 2016 and the results of the election. But before we get to the election and its result, it was, as you said, the thinking that came after Ferguson. We all had our moment of where we were that day when the lack of indictment came down on the television. Where were we? Where were you? And then what we felt. It was in the morning, from what I recall, here on the East Coast. And what we felt throughout the course of the day. How are we going to process that? So my question to you is, where did the insight come from, given all the historical scholarship, all the deterioration in terms of progress, economic rights, healthcare opportunities, basic security, as you said, just the right to live, to walk down the street. You know, when we talk about the fundamental basic foundations of a human right, to have that turn on the phrase when the media is so bent on focusing, as much as they want to proclaim we live in a colorblind society now, a post-racial America, to say, you know, whether they say it deceptively or hypocritically or in a sinister or cynical way, it's that black rage. Look at the rioting. Look at the reactions.
Yeah.
And for you, in that ingenious moment, to just turn that and say, wait a minute, we're talking about white rage. Can you take us back to the moment when you had the insight for that phrase? And what does that mean for the work, and what does that mean for its consequences?
Thank you. I was in my office, my home office, and preparing for, I was in a thing called the op-ed project that prepares faculty, teaches faculty how to write op-eds for a public audience. So how to use your expertise to be able to then convey that expertise and speak to a contemporary moment to a broader audience. And I was in my home office at my computer preparing for our workshop that day, and I had my TV on, and I see Ferguson on fire. And it didn't matter what news station, because the power of remote is that, you know, you're hitting that button. And I'm hitting the button, and they're all saying the same thing. Ooh, look at that black rage. Oh, look at black folks burning up where they live. Who burns up where they live? And as I'm hearing this, I'm hearing what I call the narrative of black pathology. You know, America would be fine if only black folks, boom, valued education. If only, boom, black folks weren't thugs. Boom, if only black folks cared about their families and their kids. Boom, you know, all of these, America would be fine except for black folk. And that was what I was hearing in this black rage, black rage, black rage. And I started shaking my head. I said, no, what we're really seeing is white rage. And then I went, oh, like a Scooby-Doo moment, right? And what that was is I had lived in Missouri for over a decade. I had seen the ways that public policy systematically undermined African Americans' access to their citizenship rights. And what we saw in that moment, I liken it to, as a nation and as the media, we are so drawn to the flames that we miss the kindling. And the kindling are those white rage policies. And so we often think of rage as being this explosion, this violence, like January 6th. But when I'm talking about rage, I'm talking about those very sinister, manipulative, destructive policies that undermine the achievement of basic rights. And that's what we saw when we looked at Ferguson. If what you saw was, what the media saw was a black kid who had gone into a store, said something to the store owner and left, the cop was there and the cop shot him. What we didn't see was at least 15 years of a public education system that failed to function. What we didn't see was a police force that looked at that black community and extracted wealth from that community by over-policing. So, oh, you were doing 26 and a 25. That's a $50 ticket. And this is a working class community, right? Oh, you rolled through that stop sign. $50 ticket, $100 ticket. 25% of Ferguson's operating budget, the city's operating budget, was extracted from the black community via fines and court fees. 25% of the operating budget. What we didn't see was how in a community where African Americans are 67% of the city's population, the voter turnout rate in the municipal election was only 6%. The work that has to be done, that's Jim Crow-like, all right? So the work that has to be done, it was when those elections were held. It was the way that the ballot was constructed. It was the information that's on the ballot. So nothing about political parties of the candidates is on the ballot. All of that drove down black voter turnout. Policies, 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 policies to alienate, policies to disassociate African Americans from their rights. When you don't see that kindling and all you see are the flames, it makes it really easy to talk about black pathology. And so when I came to that realization, then I used my historical lens and I saw that pattern over and over and over. I saw it after Reconstruction, where you have the radical Republicans craft a series of you have the radical Republicans craft a series of amendments to the Bill of Rights, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that abolishes slavery, that provides for due process and equality before the law and birthright citizenship, and that provides for the right to vote, that the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, as well as the Force and Enforcement Acts, dealing with segregation as well as dealing with white domestic terrorism. And then watching the U.S. Supreme Court come in and systematically dismantle that structure of citizenship that the radical Republicans had put in place to protect the freed people. And watch them do that in that really clinical, analytical way that doesn't look like it's violent, but it's what I call bureaucratic violence. It is the way that a policy can crush the right to vote. For instance, in the rise of Jim Crow, after Mississippi passed its disfranchising clauses, the literacy test, the poll tax, the U.S. Supreme, and so you had 190,000, in 1890 there were 190,000 African Americans registered to vote in Mississippi. 2 years after the passage of the Mississippi Plan, there were only 8,600. The U.S. Supreme Court looked at that in 1898 and said, poll tax and the literacy test don't violate the 15th Amendment because everybody has to pay a poll tax and everybody has to pass the literacy test. Everybody does not have 400 years of slavery in their background. Everybody does not have the systematic denial of quality education after the Civil War. Everybody does not have sharecropping in their history after the Civil War, on top of centuries of unpaid labor. So the ability to pay the poll tax, the ability to read sections of the U.S. Constitution or the state constitution are racially determined. But the U.S. Supreme Court ignored all of that, ignored already the effects of the laws on black voter registration, and said, this doesn't violate the Constitution. Yeah, that's the kind of white rage. And it's the white rage we saw after the Brown decision. So you think about the Brown decision, and that's the thing where black folks have been fighting so hard to get their babies educated. And watching how you had these districts that would not provide even high schools for black children, and that were really fine with this massive differential in funding. So like in Mississippi, there were some districts where the differential in funding between black children and white children was 1,500%. A 1,500% differential in funding. And we look at these black children going, well, why can't you read? What's wrong with you? The narrative of black pathology, right? And so you have the Brown decision that says separate but equal has no place in this land. And black folks are like, yes! Woo! Oh, the promised land. I can see America being America. Oh, this is going to be great. And you had senators, U.S. senators, and you had governors, and you had attorneys general rise up and say, oh, we're going to stop this. So, again, we think of rage as coming from some unintelligent, uneducated sector of the community. But these are folks with Harvard degrees, Yale degrees, University of Georgia degrees, Ole Miss degrees. These are college-educated folk. These are the respectable members of society. And they are passing laws to figure out how to stop that U.S. Supreme Court decision. And one of the laws that they passed dealt with shutting down the entire public school system and then providing state funding for white children to be able to use their vouchers to go to all-white segregated academies while offering nothing for black children. And in Prince Edward County, they were shut down for 5 years. And I say to folks, so imagine you're in the 5th grade and your school system shuts down. It opens up again when you're in the 10th. Think of everything that you have missed. And think about how society turns to you and says, well, you're graduating in a couple of years. Be ready to hit that high-tech, technology-driven, knowledge-based economy, because the industrial economy was beginning to weaken by this time. That's white rage. And that's what I began to lay out in this book, that for every major advancement of African Americans toward their full rights, a wave of policies would come up and systematically undermine those rights and make it look legitimate and make it look like there was a viable reason for doing so. The war on drugs. So after the civil rights movement, this is a nation that, even you've got the right wing quoting Martin Luther King. Now, misquoting Martin Luther King, but quoting him nonetheless, right? Because they're like, okay, that's Martin Luther King. And there's this thing about the civil rights movement. It's that moment where the U.S. was like, whoo, we have overcome. Look at us cross this racial Rubicon. Look at us. Aren't we something? This is what we mean about the power of democracy. I mean, it becomes the example of how this nation can perfect itself, can get rid of one of its major stains, and that's the power of the civil rights movement. But what that real power meant was more than white rage could deal with. And so you start seeing the rise of the war on drugs. Because again, this sounds reasonable. Nobody wants drugs flooding into their communities and the damage that these drugs can do. Nobody wants the criminals that are attached to these drugs being able to just take over their communities. But what the war on drugs actually does is that it targets black communities. African Americans, multiple studies have been done, show that African Americans use drugs the least of any racial or ethnic group in the United States. Where it's equal is marijuana. But the hard drugs, the least. But we have locked up most the group that does drugs the least. And you might say to yourself, why? Why would we spend $1 trillion doing that? Why would we destabilize state budgets doing that? Why would we strip money from our education to be able to lock up folks? Because what it costs to lock up people is almost the equivalent of tuition to be able to go to the top universities in the states. And the reason is simple. Because the power of the civil rights movement gave us the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and it gave us the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The Civil Rights Act deals with anti-discrimination, but there's an if-then-but clause in there. If you're a felon, there's some housing you're not going to be able to get. If you're a convicted felon, there is some educational opportunities you're not going to be able to have. So I can discriminate against you in education and in housing and in employment because of a felony conviction. Then when it comes to the right to vote, states have the power to disfranchise convicted felons. So by the time we got to 2018, we had over 6 million Americans who could not vote because of a felony conviction. 0.7 million of them were in Florida alone. 40% of black men in Florida could not vote because of a felony conviction. Over 20% of all African American adults in Florida could not vote because of a felony conviction. And Florida was one of a handful of states that had what they called permanent felony disfranchisement. So even after you got out of prison, after you have served your time on parole or probation, you still could not vote. You had lost your voting rights. Now, they had a wonky, awkward, politicized process to gain your voting rights back, but you had to submit it to the governor's commission, and they only met 4 times a year, and they had to go through over 10,000 petitions. So you know how that was working. It wasn't. So what that does then is that you've got the Voting Rights Act, but with massive felonies, you're able to short-circuit the power of the Voting Rights Act. White rage. And then there's the election of Barack Obama. Now that's when the nation was doing its, it was like, Lord, look at us. Lord, look at us. Woo, look at what we did. We put a black man in the White House. Oh, aren't we something? We are amazing. This is an amazing democracy. And what that was really saying was we whites overwhelmingly voted to put a black man in the White House. No. The majority of whites who have voted have not voted for a Democratic candidate for president since 1964. since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. So this wasn't about, wow, the majority of whites voted for Barack Obama and put a black man in the White House. Instead, what this was you had a sizable number of whites, but Obama had a ground game like nobody's business. And he and his team registered millions upon millions of folks who had never voted before. They were overwhelmingly African American, Latino, Asian American, the young, and the poor. That would become the hit list for voter suppression. And you again would begin to see these white rage policies go after these groups because these groups dared to believe that they were American citizens and had the right to vote.
This takes me to your next major work, and thank you for that very deep reflection. When I think of white rage, it's a conceptual horizon for us scholars to really dive into because it insinuates itself into society, law, politics, and economics, all the interrelations thereof. You know, one of the great insights of critical race theory is that there's a structural determinism that leads to inequality and disparities within the law itself. Mm-hmm. That's a bit ironic. The law should be applied equally, as you said. And the moment it doesn't, and there's a history of that, beginning with the black struggle, and eventually other racial groups too, as they started to settle into the United States, with their own trajectories of exclusion and oppression. But if you walk it back to right after slavery, the most important act that one could undertake was the right to vote, probably even before the acquisition of property. But to look at those sinister policies that you talked about, that takes you to the next work, because we're going to be talking about the law here. One person, no vote. Another great phrase, by the way. It's not one person, one vote as the heart of our democracy, but when we look at through this lens, you know, many Americans either buy the idea of fake news or conspiracy theory, especially after the 2016 and then 2020 loss for President Trump. The conspiracy theory on voter fraud, stealing the votes, the system is rigged. You know, the mechanisms by which state legislatures can determine whether there's certain sanctity to the process of voting, we can't trust them. It's this paranoia-driven kind of populist movement. But as you've taught us, and other scholars, one of the offshoots of critical race theory is critical white studies. And for me, the definition of that is the sort of insidious and subtle mechanisms by which white power creatively finds ways to reproduce itself in a different age. Mm-hmm. Because it can't exactly look like the overt system of oppression that we've had through previous epochs, Jim Crow segregation, and of course, prior to that, the evil of slavery. How do we educate the public about the systemic nature of voter profession? So this takes us to the heart of your 2018 work, One Person, No Vote. How do we educate the general public, looking ahead to 2 years from now with the general election? When, as you said, there are palpable white fears, not everyone, but it is something endemic in our society, and we have to be willing to tell that truth. When you and I know the demographic shifts, we don't have to remind people that if you look at younger millennials, Gen Z, and to define that for the larger audience, we in academia know that because they're now our undergrads, and the emerging alpha, the new ones, who are following them, they are majority minority, and we have the highest percentage of multiracial people in our society than we've ever had. And in fact, President Obama being the first example, given his generation from 1960. How do we educate ourselves in the academy and the public that there is this minoritization, and it's not just some kind of consequence that happens to be unfolding today, and perhaps more rapidly than others might have anticipated in terms of the projection. But there's a relationship between that and this real fear that we should all have that voter suppression, gerrymandering, and the redistricting that can occur in our legal system post-Shelby is something that is just as concernful today as would have been back in the 1960s with the birth of the civil rights platforms. That we should be as concerned today as folks were back then when they led the movement from segregation to, in effect, what should have been a more equal America. So tell us about the work and tell us about how we deal with the future younger generations.
What is fascinating for me, there's a lot fascinating, but is the way that the lie of voter fraud has been deployed to mask what is essentially how do we maintain white control dominance over the levers of power, the levers of political power. And we do that in a way, it was the way that Mississippi did it in 1890. There were more registered black men than there were registered white men, because women didn't have the right to vote back in 1890. So there were more registered black men than there were white men. Mississippi legislature started hollering voter fraud. There was no documentation of voter fraud. Now, there had been election fraud, where whites had stuffed the ballot box, where they had used intimidation to keep black folks away from the polls, where they had miscounted the count. They had done all kinds of maneuvering to try to dilute black political power. That is what we're seeing now. But it's really hard. Sometimes you're getting the veneer coming off when they start talking about the great replacement theory, which basically says, and you see it sometimes when they're being very explicit now, where they're like, they're bringing in all of these immigrants so that these immigrants can vote and dilute white political power. They're trying to take over by changing the demographics of the electorate. But you don't hear that as often as you hear election integrity, as often as you hear voter fraud. Because what that is doing, so you take coming out of the 2020 election, Donald Trump and his minions identified Atlanta, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, where they stole the election. Those are cities that have sizable black populations. And so basically what they're saying is, again, that narrative of black pathology. Black folks are criminals. Black folks therefore stole this election. And the next component of that, they stole this election from good, honest, hard-working white Americans. They stole this from us. So when you saw that assault on the Capitol, when they're like, we're taking back our house, the racialized messages are all through there. That noose was a racialized message. That Confederate flag in through the halls of Congress was a racialized message. The N-word being thrown at black police officers, about as racialized as it gets. It was saying you do not have the rights as an American citizen. Your votes aren't legal. You don't count. And so how do we get the message across, A, that this democracy is hanging by a thread? We have over about 300 election deniers running for office, for governor, for attorney general, for secretary of state. What that means to Generation Z is you have people in power who believe that you don't count, who want to be in power, who believe that you don't count and will never count. Your issues are irrelevant. You care about climate, so what? You care about reproductive rights, so what? You care about the LGBTQ community, so what? You care about affordable housing, so what? You care about affordable education? Forget about it. I don't even want you to be able to have your student loan debt relieved. So Generation Z, so part of the thing is to message what are the implications, to connect those dots between these election deniers and these racists and these homophobes who want to wield that piece of political power into policy that are destructive to the vast majority of American citizens. And so it is to connect those dots in podcast, to connect those dots on Twitter and in social media, to connect those dots on television, to connect those dots in our scholarship, where our students are reading our works. So wherever those folks are, it's also requiring us as scholars to reach into the community, to the folks who aren't going to college, so that those dots are connected for them as well. And then the other part of connecting those dots is these are the implications of this, but we're not helpless. We are not helpless. We have the power to vote. As many barriers as they have consistently put in front of us, we have hopped over every doggone one of them. We have barreled through every last one of them. We have dug underneath them, gone around them, and we will vote. I think about the 2020 primary in Georgia, and Lord, Georgia, and Cobb County, which is a county in metro Atlanta, the line stretched 11 to 12 hours to vote. And they interviewed a young brother who was standing in line. He's like, yeah, I've been in line for 12 hours. I'm not getting out of this line. I'm going to vote. I'm going to be heard in this democracy. That's what we do. That's what we do. And so how this message gets through to Gen Z is to connect the dots about what are the implications of these folks, how it affects your life, and then to make clear that you have the power to make sure that that doesn't happen by registering to vote and then voting.
Thank you, Professor Anderson, because in our classrooms, when we try to teach that the fear of diversity is not just psychological, it is real and material. The purchase parity power and the size of the Gen Z and the younger millennials, collectively, if you put them together, let's say 35 and under, of the voting age, to have to face the headwinds of the deterioration of basic rights that were taken for granted, the evisceration of Roe that just occurred.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even have time to process the shock of that before we can imagine what's to come. Let's say when we think about affirmative action.
Oh, and Clarence Thomas was clear in the Dobbs decision when he wrote his concurring opinion.
Mm-hmm.
We're coming after Griswold, which is birth control, right? Birth control.
Mm-hmm.
We're coming after Obergefell, which is same-sex marriage. You know, I noticed that he didn't put loving in there, which dealt with interracial marriage. But loving is on the block too.
Sure.
I mean, it is a vision of America that is pre-1950. That's the vision. The fear, and really what's driving this is the fear that women aren't having enough babies. So if you can make sure that they're not educated, if you can make sure that they don't have access to birth control, if you can make sure that they have children on demand, you can put women back in their place. Yeah.
To use the language of the cis, hetero-patriarchal system that's dominated history, makes historians' heads spin because you're talking about, as we go forward, we go back in time. So, speaking of going back in time, again back to the end of the Civil War. You know, tragically in our society, we've begun to normalize ourselves, maybe kind of anesthetize ourselves to the tragedy of school shootings and the mass shootings, then the political system and the discourse and the debate is around that. It's around the Second Amendment and about gun regulation and when can we actually come together and meet across the aisle and do something sensible. This is all true and necessary, and it doesn't take away the fears and the pain that we parents feel when we see something like that. I remember President Obama tearing up after Newtown in Connecticut when those babies were murdered. Oh my God. But we have to go underneath here, which is what you do in your latest work, 2021, the second race and guns in fatally unequal America. You know, to think about who is responsible for, not the defense. This is not, as your book says, it's not about defending and taking the for or against. We're not talking about that per se. That's the current sort of political conversation. We have to go deeper than that and trace the history. That the thesis is not outlandish. You've set out to prove it. That the defense of the Second Amendment, which of course condones mass shooters from picking up guns so quickly to be able to wreak the havoc that they do, who are, from what I can tell, since Columbine to now, almost, there's exceptions, but almost exclusively white male. And to tell the other side, the other history, that the defense of this amendment is predicated also on the disarming of black people. Not just to perpetuate the narrative of black pathology, as you said, but to instantiate the power based on a false fear that the arming of black people as a Second Amendment right that should be valued because the law should be applied equally in the 14th Amendment, that the fantasy goes way back in time, right after liberation from slavery in the Civil War. But to take it up to the present, that the current environment cannot see that when you disarm black people and you keep them in a state of vulnerability, that whether it's the white mob from Jim Crow that acted with impunity, and you saw the genius of Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, who, if they were alive today, would be thinking, am I still living in 1905, 1903, as opposed to 2022? But the disarming of black people to perpetuate the status of vulnerability. And you transfer this as a social norm to the level of the state, who today can kill an unarmed black person for a traffic violation, which has sparked the movements since 2010 at least, 2012 from my recollection to now. Take us into the heart of that discussion, because it's not, as you said, a question of how we're going to go about debating the Second Amendment, which we all could have our own views on. It's about this structural issue of perpetual disarmament based on the preservation of white power. How did you come to this work? Why now? And what is its legacy? What are the consequences of the work, and what do you envision in terms of your future work after this last book?
I came to the second with the killing of Philando Castile, who was the black man up in Minnesota who had been pulled over by the police. And the officer asked to see his ID. And Philando Castile, following NRA guidelines, alerted the officer that he has a license to carry weapon with him in the car, but he is reaching for his ID as the officer had asked. And the officer put 5 bullets into Philando Castile. 5 bullets into a licensed illegal gun owner. And the NRA went virtually silent. I went, what, are these the same folks who called federal officers from Ruby Ridge and Waco jackbooted government thugs? So I know that they can spew some game. And so the fact that they were just like, well, we've got to let the investigation carry through, and we believe that anybody, regardless of race, has the right to bear arms. I mean, it was so milquetoast that it led pundits to ask, well, don't black folks have Second Amendment rights? Well, as a rights scholar, as a human rights scholar, I asked that question. I said, that's one I haven't looked at before. And so I went hunting, and it sent me back into the 17th century. And what I saw going through the laws of the era was this fear of black people, this fear of retribution, and this definition, this codification of black people as being inherently violent, inherently criminal, inherently dangerous, and that the white community had to consistently be protected from this danger. And what I saw working through time from the era of slavery through the Civil War, through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement, through Obama, was that regardless of the legal status of black folk, you consistently had the same framing, that they are dangerous, they are criminal, they are inherently violent, we must protect the white community. And so it was watching Patrick Henry, who gets heralded as one of the, the founding fathers, just, give me liberty or give me death, arguing in the Virginia Constitutional Ratification Convention that James Madison had messed up something fierce by putting control of the militia in the Constitution under federal control. And he and George Mason are like, look, the United States will have these folks like from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. We can't count on them to call in the militia when our slaves revolt. We will be left defenseless. And so they basically did what Southerners did at the time. They threatened the United States of America's viability. They basically said, we will hold a new constitutional convention if we don't get the protection that we deserve, that we must have. And that's the Second Amendment. So when you think about it, the way that the Bill of Rights is set up, freedom from and freedom of religion, freedom of the press, free speech, freedom of assembly. You have the right not to be illegally searched and seized. You have the right to a speedy and fair trial. You have the right to a jury of your peers. You have the right not to be to have cruel and unusual punishment. The right to a well-regulated militia for the security of a free state. The right to bear arms shall not be abridged. What? I mean, that thing is such an outlier in the way that it is constructed and its intent. It's the bribe to the South. And so sitting in the Bill of Rights is the right to contain and control black people's rights. And what I mean in terms of this longer arc, whether enslaved or free black, whether a denizen, which is that in-between space between free and citizen, whether a freed people after the Civil War, whether a Jim Crow black, whether a after the Civil Rights Movement African American, or whether a post-racial African American. Consistently, the Second Amendment has treated them as dangerous. And we see this even today. In this past summer, for instance, Jalen Walker, who was a young black man up in Akron, Ohio, the police were trying to pull him over for an equipment violation on his car. He took off driving. 4.5-minute car chase. And the cops said that he shot at them, one shot at them. He then hopped out of his car, empty-handed, running in a parking lot. They fired at him 90 times. 46 of the bullets hit in this one young man. 46 bullets. The coroner said there was no alcohol, no drugs in his system, but they couldn't do a gunshot residue test to see if he'd actually fired a bullet because there were so many bullets in his right arm and hand that the test would be wholly unreliable. What the cops said, though, was that we were afraid he was a threat. Meanwhile, the white man who went up into Buffalo hunting black people under the Great Replacement theory killed 10 African Americans in a grocery store in Buffalo. The police took him alive. There's this consistent theme that comes through in who's a threat and who's not a threat. When we don't deal with the anti-blackness that undergirds the Second Amendment, we keep having the wrong conversation. And what this has meant then is that as a society, we have said that we are willing to be unsafe in our schools. We are willing to be unsafe in our churches and synagogues. We are willing to be unsafe in our recreational facilities. We are willing to be unsafe at work just so that we can be safe from those people. So that we have to rethink what real safety and real security looks like. Because this ain't it. This is not what it looks like. You think about, we had Buffalo and Uvalde in Texas, where a gunman with an AR-15, a military-grade weapon, goes into an elementary school and guns down 19 children and 2 teachers. And because of the firepower, what that bullet does from an AR-15, it basically shreds the body. Is that the parents couldn't even identify their children. They had to look at their shoes, or they had to do DNA test. And so now what Texas has done, instead of dealing with the flood of guns in the area, because they loosened the gun laws where you don't need any kind of license, is that they have sent DNA kits to parents, just in case something happens and you need to identify your child in case of an emergency. That is a complete abdication of responsibility and a complete Kafkaesque look at what real safety and security looks like in this society. This is the power of anti-blackness driving these policies.
Thank you for taking us to our conclusion on that inspiring note. Anti-black racism first and foremost, but we can think about anti-BIPOC racism. It's that asymmetry of capture but not kill when it's the white executors. I'm thinking Arbery in Georgia, Dylan Roof, who you referenced, in South Carolina, that was some years ago, and then recently Buffalo. But the inverse is the unarmed BIPOC, particularly black people, from slavery on to now, that are the most vulnerable at the hands of both society and the state. I mean, that invites us to think about comparisons with other Western democracies who are also diversifying. Western European countries are thinking about the diversification of their societies, given the legacy of decolonization, going back to your first works. They have to work it out. But as you mentioned, the outlier, that's to quote you, that's the great word, because it's not just the outlier of the perdurance and the survivability of the Second Amendment. It's the fact that it's underlaced with the structural fear of people of color.
Yes.
And the fact of the matter is, in the Americas anyway, I think Brazil is the only other country you can compare us to, we've already crossed the threshold in terms of becoming a multiracial society. Maybe if you think about it, I don't know, I was a kid, but in the 80s and 90s, when people were thinking, okay, that's going to be way off, that's going to be in 2050. But here we are. And you know what? We're coming into the academy. So can you conclude our reflections today, Professor Anderson, my last question for the day. And then I'll, of course, thank you for your visit and hopefully to continue the conversation. It's been such a pleasure. What is our message to hope? Because, again, we cannot delay these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campuses. It's one thing to say that we're engaged in diversity, equity, inclusion. It's another thing to recognize the visceral embodiment of the institution, where the young people are so intersectionally complex. And by that I mean we have American students of color, we have first gen, we have the underprivileged, we have first gen from the poor white communities all across the country. We have an international student body, typically up to about 20%, who may face xenophobia and racism when they come here. But then we got the intergenerational BIPOC experience, which is the structural racism, which is what we've been talking about. And we have young people now staring down the notion that their reproductive rights, what reproductive rights? We may have a future generation, this sounds dystopian, where they won't even know that such a thing exists. The headwinds are there. The acceleration of climate change, we can go on. Gun safety. What's our message to institutions? Maybe that's the next work, if I can drop a hint, tracing the history. Because a lot of campuses are engaged in that self-reflection on decolonization, understanding their roots and their histories. Require an authentic dialogue with those peoples who were displaced, the Native Americans. But we think about the black struggle particularly as to, what's our message? That we have to start thinking about shifting the values of the institution so we can have that authentic dialogue with the younger people who are already here. What are your closing remarks and thoughts about the future of the academy when we think about these issues of diversity and rights?
Don't be afraid. In fact, embrace this work. So there's so much in the cultural biosphere that is hammering on these institutions to not teach divisive topics, to not be so woke. To me, that means ignore humanity. And there's pressure on these institutions to capitulate to that political pressure. Don't capitulate. Don't capitulate. Because what that does, I liken it to Lyshenko, who was the Soviet biologist back in the Stalin era, who came up with a really whacked idea of genetics that was driven by communist ideology and not by science. And it set the Soviets back, their agricultural system back, decades, because they were following ideology and not the science. Trying to understand our system and our structures without engaging the role of racism and sexism and xenophobia and homophobia. It's like trying to figure out how to build an airplane, but you don't understand gravity. You won't even acknowledge gravity. How do you even know how to get that thing off the ground unless you understand that there is a force that is pulling it to the earth? Don't be afraid. As scholars, as institutions of higher learning, we engage the work because we know the work is so important. We know it's how we move forward. We know it's how we build the citizenry that is engaged, that is intellectually rigorous, and has the capacity to continue to learn, to continue to pull in these ideas, to continue to think critically, to continue then to work on the policies that will shape our future. Don't back down. That's the message. Don't back down.
And we won't. Thank you, Professor Anderson. It was such a pleasure to have you here at Brandeis.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.